The fear of freedom. The fear of freedom is a look at why the human race has tolerated tyrants for so long. Why do we endure this life of oppression and work so hard in an economy controlled by the most avaricious among us? The great social organizations of the insects are miracles of highly stratified and tightly controlled activity. But is this level of control appropriate for humans? Are we animals that require the same level of guidance that we find in insect communities? Are the fixed boundaries found in the lower orders needed at the highest levels of life? Are we not free, because we fear freedom? That is, do we not fear what would happen without the layers of control over us? Freedom is something we strive for in the abstract but abhor in application. Without regulations, crime, waste, oppression and mayhem make themselves known. We fear the freedom of others. Perhaps we even fear what would happen if we were free. Sometimes we fear the freedom of ourselves. We look at the cost or consequence of freedom and prefer the costs and security of a well-armed police force. Businesses call for less government, but even libertarians fear the costs of unfettered business activity. This is the paradox of freedom. Rebellion starts with the child's struggle against parental domination and in less demonstrative ways continues on throughout life, to end with a quiet desperation of the old and infirm, battling those who are required to assist them. We do not like obeying others. We desire to be free of all imposed obligations. But we cannot rid ourselves of all imposed authority, without removing it from everyone else. We struggle even against inherent weaknesses and genetic disorders and the overwhelming might of time to no avail, but many refuse to give in even to the inevitable. The struggle may seem to strengthen us, but often it is a form of imprisonment defined by the very barriers we push against. Willful freedom is selfish, egotistical and often intolerant not only of the needs of others but of reality itself. Pure will transcends and sublimates the ego. Only the pure will of the undefiled, human can contain and restrain the ego. The pure will is not impositional. The will does not impose itself on others. Authoritarianism flows from the ego, not the will. When ego is eliminated, the ego no longer imposes demands, neither on oneself nor in business. We work to earn the trust of the business's customers. This requires integrity. This requires an exercise of the will, on the part of the business owner. Pure will strives for honesty and honesty engenders trust. Pure will must control ego, because if the ego is in control, the person is guided by ego gratification. When ego predominates, trust will be broken. Honesty in business has to start with eliminating ego. The ego unfettered means trust will be broken. For the customer to submit to the marketing message of a business, the customer has to trust the business owner. The business cannot exist to make a profit, though this is the temptation. Profitability is a consequence, but not the purpose, of doing business. The needs of the customer have to be paramount. It is not right to impose hidden costs on the customer, just to earn a profit. Businesses create products and services. But if the business does not focus on the needs of the customer, its purpose is lost. The profit motive can undermine what the business ought to be doing. The customer is just the means to an end when the end is the bottom line. In a personal relationship, ego needs can begin to predominate. The other in the relationship becomes a means to an end, the end being the cultivation of the ego. The person focused on ego gratification is likely to be seen as selfish, overbearing and unworthy of having his or her needs catered to. It is not that demands cannot be made on the other person, but when these demands stem from a sense of superiority and entitlement, ego gratification has become the purpose of the relationship. This is not a healthy relationship. When ego is sublimated and transcended, the will is free of ego needs. Pure will seeks association with will. Pure feminine will seeks association with the pure masculine will. Pure will sublimates ego, and this requires the support of a complementary will. The female submits to the male to purge her ego. The feminine ego does not wish to submit. Instead of living in the flesh, the female seeks submission to the headship of the male will. Pure will always seeks freedom from the domination of ego. Ego lives in the flesh and excites the needs of the flesh. Male headship does not stem from the needs of the flesh but the opposite. The male is focused on breaking down the ego defenses of the female. This requires sublimation of the ego on the part of the male. Only when ego is sublimated to the will, and when this will is cognizant of the will of another, is freedom from the flesh possible. Relationships exist to the degree trust exists. This trust is based on the domination of ego by the will. If one or both persons permit ego to intervene and escape the constraints of the will, the relationship is harmed. The level of submission is proportional to the female's sense of trust. To deepen her trust and level of submission, the male cannot be motivated by ego. Control requires the male dominate his ego needs. The intervention of ego and the weakening of the will is why relationships end. Ego cannot form relationships other than those intent on domination and destruction. Egos resolve into mob rule and riots. The sublimation of the female ego to the will of the man is in response to the ego control of the male and proportional to it. Having eliminated ego, the man is now free to nurture the feminine will of the woman. Pure will is spiritual, which means it is divorced from the physical. Pure will is conceptual in that it is the incarnation of information. The conceptual link between information nodes is trust. Information cannot be conveyed without trust. In business, the business owner sublimates his or her will to the needs of his or her customer, to create a bond of trust. Entrepreneurs are created by an act of will. To form a business requires investors' delay gratification. The will is directed towards the fulfillment of the customer's needs and of the needs of the business. The world has cultivated ego. Are the people who wish to lead and desire to lead and who lead even when no leadership is required, people who ought to lead? Historically, the role of the leader, stroke the leader's ego. The leadership role is a prestigious position, because it strokes the leader's ego. But though we venerate leaders, the tendency is for the leader to impose their will onto those under them, often in unpleasant ways. The reaction to this prompted the use of law and parliaments, as a way of reining in the leader's ego. A man who cannot control himself cannot control others. A person cannot maintain a relationship, if he cannot control himself. The politics and business climate favor ego stroking, but this increases the possibility of egoism. We want to be free, but we fear freedom. The ego is a dangerous animal when out of control. Law is a cumbersome device to control egos. The ego fears freedom, but the will cannot live without it. Fear is a barrier to freedom, and the ego is the seat of fear. The world needs to replace the ego stroking of this fear-based culture and learn pacifism, or doing that which is directed at peace, specifically placating the anger of the Lord. We fear freedom because we fear others. Our freedom, we fear, may put us at the mercy of others, and so we sacrifice freedom for the regulatory power of the state. We trade the formal violence of the state for the unpredictable violence of the jungle, yet the operating principle remains the same. To have freedom there must be peace. The only peace possible is in a reconciliation to God. Those who rebel against God cannot find peace. The state nor its detractors can provide peace, outside of servitude. The law of the jungle, no matter how effective it is applied, can provide peace. No man or group of men are so strong they can ensure peace and freedom without total domination. This is why man needs God. Only in faith can we find freedom, and there is no faith when there is enmity with God.